Hi, this is Abba King, and welcome to my podcast where we talk about politics, philosophy, and religion from an African perspective. South Africa is a deeply divided society. This is a well-known fact which is hardly explored in depth. This month, we'll be looking at Chabani Manganyi's Being Black in the World, a collection of essays where he explores various themes of the Black experience in South Africa. In today's episode, we will turn our attention to Chapter 3 of the book, titled Us and Them. Now, as a rule of the podcast, our primary engagement with thinkers we engage with is at an intellectual level. This is because we affirm that all human beings are not exclusively biographical subjects, but are also thinking subjects. Having said so, it is also important to have some biographical details of the thinker that we engage with in order for us to have a clearer context of them. This will help us to know who influenced the thinker in question and who the thinker influenced. The emphasis, however, will remain on the intellectual work of the thinker, Chabani Manganyi in this case. Professor Chabani Manganyi is a writer of prominence who has a distinguished career in psychology, education, and government, having held highly prestigious appointments in educational and academic spheres. He was born in the district of Leeuwardtje, and after his schooling, he studied in the University of South Africa, where he completed a Bachelor of Arts and received an honors degree in psychology in 1964. MA in 1968 and a D.Litt in 1970. His doctoral thesis was on the body image in paraplegia. As a part of his doctoral requirements, he held an internship in clinical psychology at Baragwanath Hospital, where he was later appointed as a clinical psychologist there, making him the first Black clinical psychologist in South Africa, a post he occupied for 3 years until he left to take a post-doctoral fellowship at Yale University. He began publishing in the early 1970s. In 1976, Professor Manganyi took up a professorship at University of Transkei, where he established the Department of Philosophy and served as the first chair. In 1980, he was appointed as Senior Research Fellow and Visiting Professor at the University of Witwatersrand African Studies Institute. This was to be his home for the next 10 years, and the place where he produced two of his most important works that laid the foundation for his subsequent research. He also continued his clinical practice part-time and spent 1985 back at Yale as a visiting fellow. In 1990, he became the Vice-Chancellor and the Principal of the University of the North, and he was the Executive Director of the Private Sector Initiative Joint Education Trust in 1993 and 1994. When a fully democratic government was established in 1994 in South Africa, Manganyi stepped into the office of Director General in the Department of Education, a position he held until 1999, when he became advisor and the Vice-Chancellor of University of Pretoria in 2003. He was appointed as Vice Principal of University of Pretoria and held the office until 2006. He was also chairperson of the Council on Higher Education. In the 1970s and the early 1980s, he published a series of monographs, the first of which was Being Black in the World in 1973, and the last, Looking Through the Keyhole in 1981. In these works, Manganyi incisively examined the effects of institutionalized racism on the internal worlds and external realities of South Africans. To this end, he explored a range of group and individual responses to the forms of institutionalized racism that characterized South Africa at the time, including alienation, distorted relations with the body, and the quest for freedom. This information was taken from the National Research Fund website. In his exploration of the division of South Africa, Manganyi focuses on what he terms relational categories: us, the in-group, and them, the out-group. And the milieu not only makes these categorical relations possible, but also exacerbates them. In this chapter, Manganyi seeks to demonstrate that these categorical relations are related in our society to different experiences, two modes of being in the world, namely being black in the world and being white in the world. To justify this comparative analysis of these two modes of being in the world, Manganyi makes the point that the primary mode of being in the world, of existing, is a given and therefore universal. What, however, distinguishes humanity's being in the world from that of other animals is that human beings are historical beings. However, before going into the discussion, he makes some observations about the South African social environment. Manganyi notes that the most distinctive feature of apartheid South Africa is its ideological totalism. Now, to properly understand the formulation of ideology, one needs to analyze it through criteria that Manganyi called psychological themes. The first of which is milieu control. An example of milieu control is censorship and indoctrination. There were certain books that were prohibited from being read. The face and name of Nelson Mandela was prohibited from being used publicly, and indoctrination came in subtle ways, such as the methods people were used to be learning from in the Bantu education system. The second psychological category is the mystical imperative. This is the mandate for all in the community to participate in a higher purpose. Examples of this is religion, the revolution, and Western civilization. In South Africa at the time, it was that of separate development, demand for purity. This is a requirement for a homogeneity and a categorical distinction between insiders and outsiders. And the next theme is total exposure. Now, this theme is a byproduct of the demand for purity. Since members need to prove their purity, there is a demand for total exposure of the individual to the community. The next psychological theme is an aura of sacredness. This one is a key tool that ensures the longevity of an ideology. An aura of sacredness around the ideology and its basic assumptions is created by prohibiting any critical engagement with the ideology. The next psychological theme is loaded language. Now, overloading certain words and phrases with emotive language creates an emotionally charged discourse around the ideology and thus inhibits any possibility of critical engagement being able to happen with the ideology. The last psychological theme is elevation of doctrine. One of the most important psychological markers of ideological totalism is the elevation of the doctrine over the individual. The necessary consequence of this hallmark is a sustained encroachment on individual liberties. The fact of apartheid South Africa being a totalist state was a well-known and often stated fact. What, however, was less obvious and less stated was the fact that the ideological totalism of apartheid was more radically expressed in the lives of black South Africans than it was in the lives of white South Africans. This served as psychic manipulation, and it presented two dangers. The first, a totalist environment tends to lower the integrative status of a community. The implication of this is that there is a lack of social cohesion, and thus the oppressed have limited opportunities to organize against the oppressor. This also means that members of the community will lack a reliable support system. Second, the general vitality of the future generations of South Africa is jeopardized, and it would take a miracle to undo the damage that has been done by this psychic manipulation. Ideological totalism is key to understanding apartheid South Africa's social environment and how it manifests differently in black and white societies. This will help one to have a coherent account of how the earlier mentioned modes of being in the world are possible to begin with. Historicity is a key term in order to understand the origin of the relational categories that Manganyi talks about. Manganyi argues that the basic structure of existence is historical. Further, he notes that it is specifically man's historicity and his being decisive being, meaning man decides what to become, which have infused variation of this given existential structure. To put it in another way, human beings' mode of existence has two characteristic features: historicity and the ability to decide what one becomes. These two characteristics function at two different levels. To give an example of what I'm talking about, at a historical level, one can live in a geographical area that is fertile on the ground and there is a consistent water supply. In this context, one can decide to be a farmer or a fisherman or a nature conservationist. So there is a relationship between historicity and humanity's capacity to decide. To put it in a different context, imagine a person that lives in a desert that has dry lands here and there. That person cannot choose to become a fisherman. Instead, they have to decide what they are going to become in the given context that they find themselves in. And that is the relationship that there is. One decides what to become based on where they find themselves. Building on this idea, Manganyi then suggests that existence, Dasein, is dialogue and relation. An individual is always transacting with his environment. According to him, this dialogue can be established at 4 different levels, namely the body, individual in society, dialogue with objects, and relating with time. Broadly speaking, Manganyi has made 2 key points. First, being human is existing within a specific historical context. Being human also means negotiating with your environment through decisions one makes. The question arises as to what kind of historical context was South Africa at the time of his writing this essay? And now that we are in the post-94 era, has it changed? How are we transacting with our environment? Is there room for change? Please answer these questions by commenting below, and don't forget to follow the podcast, like, and share the episode. Come back next week to learn more about Manganyi's notion about humanity's dialogue with the environment at the 4 different levels.